Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
This is your time. This is your call to arms. For the Cryptid Connection is your voice. I'm your host, Jennifer.
And I'm your host, Stephen. Welcome to Cryptid Connection.
The Cryptid Connection podcast is brought to you by CryptidConnection.com, a website dedicated to you, one who has interest in all things cryptid and paranormal. CC is a place where you can enjoy a hassle-free lifestyle and community of Bigfoot pursuit. Stop by via the internet and visit. Guarantee you will start to feel at home. CryptidConnection.com.
Hi, everybody. This episode, we've got J.C. Williams. J.C. Williams is a Bigfoot researcher who has been speaking at a couple of different conferences and meetings across the country for a couple of years now. And he's got some real interesting experience actually out in the field. J.C., how you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. It's good to speak to you guys again.
Hello, JC. I want to actually elaborate the last statement Stephen said. He called you a researcher. I've heard you say otherwise. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Well, I tend to refer to myself as an investigator. The reason being I don't have a scientific background, which I don't think precludes me from being a researcher of any kind, but I think of my field work as investigations, investigating a witness encounter or going to a particular location and investigating it to see whether or not I can detect evidence of the Sasquatch, like trackway evidence and so forth. There is research involved, certainly, but I refer to myself as an investigator.
And you know, she was right for getting on to me about that, because I knew that, and I didn't even think about it. I did the cardinal sin right there, because I'm mixing investigator, enthusiast, researcher, all of that together. And there really are differences. JC's right. Very few of us are qualified to actually qualify ourselves as a researcher. You'd have to be like Dr. Meldrum or something like that to be a researcher. The rest of us, at best, investigator. Most of us, just enthusiasts.
I term myself as a skeptic, honestly.
Well, but you're a healthy, open-minded skeptic.
Fair.
Anyway, JC, now that I've been properly chastised, how are you doing? Who the hell are you? Tell us a little bit about you.
Well, originally I'm from Northern California, where I was raised. I joined the Army shortly after, actually the day after I graduated from high school. I left for basic training. I joined while I was still in high school. I was 17, and I left for basic the day after I graduated. I went to Fort Benning, Georgia, where I was also stationed, and I've been in Georgia ever since. I've been in Georgia living in Georgia since 1999. After the Army, I worked overseas for a few years as a contractor in Kuwait and Iraq on a couple of different contracts. But I think something that, on a personal note, something that I felt has always defined me is possessing an abiding passion for natural history. I've always, whether it's astronomy, herpetology, entomology, archaeology, anything that is natural history or science oriented. I've always been fascinated by. And originally my plan was to attend college, but instead I entered the Army. So after I got out and I got done contracting, I realized, after not having so many years of not having time to pursue my interests, being busy with other things, that was something I wanted to reconnect with. And among those interests was also the possibility of the Sasquatch. Being from Northern California, that was something that was talked about from time to time in campsites, and would hear people talk about it, and I would ask questions and read what books I could find on the subject. And I decided to begin my own investigations to see what I could discover. So for the last 5 years or so, that's what I've been doing pretty diligently. And in addition to that, I try to educate myself. For instance, tracking, Dr. James Halfpenny's tracking school in Gardner, Montana. I did that in 2016, taking part in Cyber Tracker, North America's evaluation. I just recently did bioacoustic and field recording courses, things of that nature to help me better my investigations when I'm on expedition.
JC, could you please let us know a little bit more about Cyber Tracker? What is it, and why do you think it benefits your research abilities?
Well, Cyber Tracker is a program. It started in South Africa, and it has expanded to North America. And it's a network of brilliant trackers, and not just track and sign, but also trailing, which involves following animals, following their tracks and finding the animal. And these people are biologists. They are natural historians or naturalists. They have a lot of books that they've written under their belts, books on natural history, from birding to tracks of North America to identifying feathers that you find on the ground, what bird that feather belongs to. So these are people with a diverse range of knowledge. And what it is with Cyber Tracker, you find an evaluation that's being held near you, and they're held throughout the United States. You find an evaluation which someone is sponsoring. They will bring a Cyber Tracker evaluator. You pay the fee, whatever fee that they may ask. I believe they differ from evaluation to evaluation. And you show up for 2 days of training and evaluation. This all happens. You're trained, you're evaluated, your knowledge is tested, all at the same time. And you can certify. And their certification process is merely a way, not of saying that you are an expert tracker or you are a tracker because you get certified through them, but it does quantify how much you know about track and sign or trailing in the particular environment that you're working in. For instance, my evaluation was in the Southeast in Alabama. Whether you certify or not with them, you're going to learn something, and you're going to be more knowledgeable than you were before you took the course. So I enjoy things like that. It's all self-guided for me, and programs like Cyber Trackers are precisely what I look for. But they have a website, trackcertifications.com. you can go there and you can look and see if there's an evaluation being held in your area or near you, because it's up to someone to host it. And if you're fortunate enough to have someone hosting a cyber tracker evaluation near you, somewhere where you can easily go, then you just contact that person through the website and pay your fee and receive your training. And all that information's on that website, trackcertification.com or trackercertification.com.
Thank you for that information. I find that very useful. I'm interested in it.
Jumping back before the cyber tracker discussion there real quick, when you were talking about how you got involved and things that interested you, you mentioned something that actually we had not talked about before, or not directly, and I'm curious. You mentioned you had done a lot of reading, as far as like Sasquatch goes and its histories, things like that. What books have you read? What authors did you follow and everything to kind of help build your base level of knowledge? I'm curious about that.
Well, I have a lot of the books that I'm sure a lot of your listeners would be familiar with, or I've read those. Dr. Meldrum's books, Dr. Bindernagel's books, so on. But I also have books that are a little bit more obscure, not written by Sasquatch researchers or researchers that are involved in that kind of research whatsoever. I have a couple of older books. They were both written. One was written actually in the 70s. One was written in the 80s. But I do remember reading this one a long time ago. I got from the library, and I just recently bought it again. It's called In Search of the Red Ape by John McKinnon. And the reason why I have this book in my library is John McKinnon is a primate researcher. And in this particular book, he documents his adventures in Southeast Asia with his wife and his young son researching orangutans. And in the book, there's a part where he talks about finding strange tracks on the ground, on the jungle floor. And he says at first he thought they were bear tracks, the sun bear. And then he discounted that, and then he thought maybe they were human tracks, but they didn't look quite human. He didn't know what they were, but they made him feel uneasy, is what he said. And it wasn't until he got back to his base camp, speaking to one of his research assistants, who was an indigenous person from that area in Asia. And his research assistant told him, that's the Patoot Suit. And so John McKinnon was in, what's the Patoot Suit? His research assistant proceeded to explain to him that the Patoot Suit is this 4 or so foot tall, hirsute ape with very long arms and a dark mane of hair on its head and going down its back. It's longer than the hair on the rest of its body. And it has a vocalization from which its name is derived, where it'll go toot, 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 these long drawn out vocalizations. And so his people call it the Patoot Suit. And John McKinnon, the author, thought, it almost sounded too fanciful to believe, but he was in a part of the world that's little explored. This was in the 70s, and it doesn't seem unreasonable to think that there may be another undiscovered species of primate left to be found there. So I have that book and another one like it that talks about the people and the culture of those countries in Southeast Asia, called Soul of the Tiger. And the two authors of this book, Jeffrey McNeely and Paul Huchtel, they have a a portion or a chapter of their book where they include stories, cultural traditions of man-like apes that the people in those areas and those different countries talk about. And the two authors coined the term untrahom, which stands for unidentified tropical hominoid, to describe the Patoot Suit or the orang pendek, or the even further up in China, the Yeren, the Chinese Yeren, to describe these animals. And in that chapter of their book, they include descriptions of these animals. And that's not what the book is about. One is an anthropologist, and one is a Jeffrey McNeely is an anthropologist, a scientist, and Paul Bachtel is just a writer, and they teamed up to write this book. So I find that fascinating that men of science back then would include information on man-like bipedal creatures because they either encountered evidence of such a creature or heard enough anecdotal evidence to include it in their works. They're not necessarily believers in that or trying to push the belief or champion the belief that there are animals like that in Southeast Asia, but they've simply included it in their work. So I find that interesting. I have books like that. I have a couple written by Vance Orchard. He lived in the Walla Walla, Washington area. He wrote 2 books about the Blue Mountains, which are the primary source material for my expeditions out there into the Blues. He was a newspaper man for 30, 40 years in that area, and he was intrigued by stories of the Sasquatch. So in his newspaper articles, he would write about it whenever the subject came up. Whenever someone would find tracks or say that they saw one, he would write about it, and he ended up writing these 2 books, compiling those experiences. And they're both very, very interesting books. They seem to be little known, and they're both out of print, although you can get copies online, but they're rather expensive. But for me, it was worth including those in my library. So that's the sort of reading material that I have here at home.
You do have quite an extensive library in regards to Sasquatch and that type of creature. And out-of-print ones, those are hard to find, I'm sure.
If you Google them, the 2 books by Vance Orchard, the first one is called Bigfoot of the Blues by Vance Orchard, and the other one is The Walla Walla Bigfoot. And the Bigfoot of the Blues, I bought my copy for $25, and my copy of the Walla Walla Bigfoot, I paid almost $60 for, but I've seen it on, I think, Amazon. I've seen it on websites for hundreds of dollars. It's like I said, they're both out of print. Vance Orchard died in the early 2000s. So they're difficult to find.
But nonetheless, I'm sure they're valuable resources of information for some people.
They were for me, especially because I spend so much time in the Blues. And they were a great resource for identifying people and places, especially where encounters and trackway finds were made. All of that information is in his 2 books, where Paul Freeman made his Freeman footage in 1992. That's well described. Paul Freeman, after his filmed encounter, he talked to Vance Orchard. They were friends. And he described to him his entire encounter beyond what you may see in Paul's film, or I should say what you will see. Paul goes into much more detail and explains events before and after the film that you would find on YouTube, for instance, which is often referenced as having been filmed in 1994. You'll find if you looked it up right now, you would see 1994 Freeman footage in Washington. And I don't know where that started, but it's clearly stated in Vance Orchard's first book, which covers the years 1982 to 1992 of Sasquatch activity in the Blue Mountains. That Paul's film was made in 1992. It was August 20th of 1992, and it was on the Oregon side of the Blue Mountains, not in Washington. And it was filmed at a location called Deduct Pond, not Deduct Springs, which it's also referenced as. Deduct Spring flows into Deduct Pond, but it was at the pond, Deduct Pond, that Paul had his filmed encounter.
Now, I really appreciate you going into that, because you've added to my reading list of what I need to look up now. There were several books you mentioned and topics that I have not included in my own reading before. And they do sound very, very interesting. I want to check them out. I was just expecting you to come off and say, "Oh yeah, well, I read the early John Green books and the Renee Dandin books, and even Marion Place's books." And instead, no, you start going right off into some actually pretty heavy duty educational material. It sounds like. I find that aspect of you very fascinating. I really do. Not many people, I don't think, use those kind of books as a base of their knowledge. And I think it is something that is very detrimental to our community, that so many people don't have a well-rounded base. And so, yeah, I find it fascinating. I really do.
Yeah, I always have as well. And I expand into reading about, for instance, the untrahams, the undiscovered tropical hominoids. Because if you have men that ventured into those regions of Southeast Asia, and as academics or explorers or men of good reputation, still bother to mention encounters with things that could very well get them laughed. To me, that it could carry a certain amount of credibility with it. To dare mention that you saw something that you could not explain, and it was 4 feet tall and covered in long hair. It was not an orangutan. The natives called it the Patoot Suit. Or, for people like that to say that they've had such encounters, I think makes the possibility of having our own undiscovered hominoid in North America, the Sasquatch, I think it increases that likelihood. These creatures in their various forms may exist across several different continents. So I find that subject in general fascinating. So those are the sorts of books that I collect.
Okay, I'm going to go with where I'm interested and peaked here right now. Could you do me a favor? And I'm not familiar with the Patoot Suit. Could you kind of break down and describe what it is? Your comment about the scientist mentioning that he didn't think he wanted to run into what had left those tracks. What kind of an animal is this that we're talking about?
Well, it seems that there are varying descriptions, and that some of these names, for instance, Patoot Suit, you might have several different groups of people in the same area referring to one creature, but giving it their own name. The Patoot in one cultural tradition, and I believe it is in Borneo. It's in Southeast Asia. I believe it's Borneo. There's a particular group of indigenous people there that call it the Patoot. And John McKinnon, the author, in Search of the Red Ape, who had that experience with the tracks, one of his research assistants, who was a local, after the tracks that John had found were described to him, he said, "Oh, that's the Patoot." And John said, "Well, what's a Patoot?" And he described it as being about 4 feet tall, covered in dark hair. Seems to have almost a mane of hair on its head and back. The hair on its head and back is longer. It has human-like ears. It has very long arms. And its name, Patoot, comes from the vocalization that it makes. They apparently, when they vocalize, it's a drawn out toot, 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 toot vocalization. So the locals called it the Patoot. That's where it gets its name. But you'll also hear other Untrahams described exactly the same way, but they have a different name. The Orang Pendek is one that's described similarly in appearance to the Patoot. There are several others in that particular area that have several different names described very similarly, which may be a description of the same animal. But John McKinnon included that chapter, or included that discovery in his book. And I found that interesting. It's a book about researching orangutans. There's nothing controversial about it. He's a well-known, well-respected scientist, and yet he mentions that. He must have thought it was important. He must have been confident that the tracks he found were not human. They were not bear. He didn't know what they were. So he included that trackway find and then the description given to him by one of his research assistants, who was a local.
It's almost like he's laying the groundwork, and the breadcrumbs will give cover to other future researchers saying that this is worth investigating. And I can see that. I mean, there are actual real scientific researchers that are now looking into the Orang Pendek as being a real possibility, at least as far as I'm aware. Now, let me ask you this. All of these books you're referencing are localized to Southeast Asia and that area. But then you mentioned that you've got these books about the Aboriginal tales and stories, and I'm assuming you're referring to Native American stories of the Sasquatch over here. Do you think that in the scientific community there may be a little bit of regional bias, I guess is what I should say? The author felt comfortable taking the risk and including that in his book because he was in Southeast Asia. Whereas someone that was over here, they automatically put it to myth and legend or whatever because it's in North America. And so you don't see those same kind of mentions or anything like that. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do. Also, I think you're probably right. Also, that last book, In Search of the Red Ape, that book was written in 1975. And you're talking about a time when, even now, much of Southeast Asia, some of the wilderness areas there, are not as well traveled or researched as one may think, and certainly not in 1975. So for someone to find tracks that they could not identify and may belong to some species of undiscovered primate may not seem like such a tall order back then. And again, you're talking about the jungles of Southeast Asia. When you're talking about a national park that's in hundreds of people's backyards, that's different. You're not talking about some far-flung exotic location,
Right.
where no white man has ever gone before. You're talking about a forest in Oregon or Washington or wherever in the United States. And that is a much more sensational claim. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And what you said, what you asked, reminded me of an anecdote that I heard. And it was a man. He was drunk and he was walking around a street lamp. He appeared to be looking for something on the ground, and a police officer saw him. And so the police officer approached him and he said, what are you doing here? And the guy said, well, I'm looking for my keys. And the officer said, okay, well, do you know where you lost them? And the old man said, no, I don't know where I lost them. And the officer asked, well, why are you looking here? And he said, well, this is the only place I can see. So the idea being, if a certain concept doesn't fall within the light of that little lamppost, no one's going to look for it. If it's in the darkness beyond the light of that little lamppost, it's discounted. Oh, well, it can't be. There are no apes in North America. So such a story like John McKinnon's in Southeast Asia, if an anthropologist or a researcher were to tell such a tale coming out of the Olympic Peninsula, they would immediately be discounted because we have no apes in North America. So he must have misidentified a bear track or a human track. Case closed. But if it's in Southeast Asia, oh, possibly. Yeah, maybe it's an orangutan-like animal, some sort of primate. It's more feasible there than it is here, because we already know there are no primates in North America. So that's not even a possibility. We're not even going to entertain that, but the possibility of a Sasquatch, because a Sasquatch is not sitting underneath that lamppost. He's out in the outer darkness, so he's discounted.
I do like the way you put that. That is very enlightening. All right. Speaking of being out in the outer darkness away from the lamppost, and speaking of forests of Oregon and Washington, let's talk a little bit about where you like to hang out and what you like to do. For those who are not familiar with JC's one of those lucky individuals that can go out and essentially get lost in the woods for months at a time. JC, tell us what you go out and do.
Well, I try not to get lost. That's rule number one. But what I do is I carry out investigations primarily in the Pacific Northwest. For the last few years, I've been focusing my investigations in the Blue Mountains of Southeast Washington State and Northeast Oregon, in the Umatilla National Forest, which is in the Blue Mountains. And I stay for extended periods of time by myself for the most part. Every once in a while, I'll have someone join me for a week or so. But I'll stay out there for 2 to 3 months at a time in one location. I don't move. I set up my base camp once, and then I break it down when I'm ready to leave. So my posture there, while there, is simply one of a camper. I have a fire pit, I have a tent, and I have my vehicle. During the day, I conduct track and sign surveys of the areas around my base camp, looking for tracks of anything, really. Setting up trail cameras. I have automated audio recorders that I set up. I bring DNA sampling kits with me, equipment like that, and everything else that I'll need to live for 3 months. And I set all that up in the field and spend the rest of my time maintaining that equipment and searching the ground.
Okay, let's go into you mentioned your equipment and everything. What's your actual, I guess you said posture. What's your methodology? More specifically, how is it you do your research? And first off, I want to explain to everybody, you're not just doing Sasquatch research. You're researching your whole environment. Can you break that down for us a little bit?
Yes. One of the pieces of equipment that I forgot to mention, which does just that, is a weather station that I built. I have a rain gauge and a little piece of equipment called a kestrel. It's the name of the company, and it measures the temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, wind direction, all that sort of thing. And of course, the rain gauge, I can document how much precipitation the area I'm in receives while I'm there. What I meant by posture was I'm not out there producing so-called Sasquatch vocalizations or using sticks to tree knock and that sort of a thing. I'm simply camping. If you were watching me, you would think that I'm just another person, another human that's up there camping for an extended period of time. And I do that because I have my base camp surrounded by cameras. They're trail cameras. And I have some recorders up as well. So not only do I have the cameras deployed out in the field in certain locations, but around me. And if you look at the anecdotal record, there are a lot of reports of people having encounters with the Sasquatch while camping, whether they be in their tent or in their truck or sitting around the campfire. They may report certain experiences, whether it's vocalizations, close vocalization, screaming just outside the firelight, having their tent slapped or their truck slapped, having rocks thrown at their vehicle or them. So the idea I have is to be I don't want to cause, if a Sasquatch were to visit my base camp, it would have no cause for alarm. I don't appear to be actively seeking them out. If it wanted to come in or they wanted to come in and rifle through my stuff or explore my ice chest or slap the side of my truck, I want them to feel free to do that. And if they do, hopefully, I'll record them doing it, is the idea I have. That's at night when I'm sleeping. During the day, I spend all my time doing track and sign surveys and documenting as much as I can about the area that I'm in to describe it, to describe the environment. What am I seeing? What am I not seeing? To build as complete a picture of that particular area of the Blue Mountains as I can.
Now, you're gathering data, like you said, in the whole complete picture. And you have found, and I realize this isn't just in the Blues, I don't believe, but you found evidence, other animals that are present in the region that you have helped Department of Wildlife with and things like that, that they didn't necessarily know. Could you expand on that and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. There were a couple of cases in the blues of one was the American marten. It's a mustelid or a weasel, and they were extirpated, made locally extinct from that area due to pressures from overhunting, fur trapping, so forth. So there's been some time where they haven't been seen there like they were historically. And one year when I was there, I was following a spring, trying to navigate over deadfall. And as I was doing so, this marten jumped off of the ground onto a standing snag, and it just sat there. And I had enough time to get my camera and take the lens cap off and snap a picture. I didn't realize it was as significant as it was at the time until I talked to a man who worked in the Blue Mountains as a biologist for the state of Oregon. And he was telling me their history there. And he ended up using that picture in an article he wrote for the Walla Walla Union Bulletin. Walla Walla, Washington is the nearest town to the part of the northern blues where I was, about 36 or 40 miles away. So there was that, and then the mountain goats, which I'd been going up there for years, and I've never seen a mountain goat. But in 2018, I did. I saw somewhere in the vicinity of 10 of them, and I got them on my cameras, and I found their tracks. And I told him about that, thinking that he would be interested. And he was. He said that the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, they were under the impression that there were no more than 4 mountain goats still living in the Blue Mountains. And I had evidence of many more than that. And they were breeding. On one particular 30-second video I captured, I set my camera traps to make 30-second videos. I recorded several nanny goats with their kids. So yeah, they're up there and they're breeding, and perhaps ODFW will do something to put a program together to help them make a comeback.
Okay. And last but not least, the thing that I think would be most interesting is the fact that you managed to get a couple of bird recordings that you recorded and were able to get them carried or featured on the Macaulay Library of Sound. And within recent years, Macaulay has become a very important resource. It's referenced a lot. And I think everybody tends to think that only the greatest PhDs and things like that can ever get onto it. And you managed to get some really good recordings out in the field of some various birds. Am I correct that got featured on Macaulay?
I have some recordings that are included in their collection. Yes, it certainly is not just for academics. There are far more amateurs who have, I'm sure, contributed to the Macaulay Library's collection than anyone with a degree. It's a matter of whether or not you have created a quality field recording with the data you want included with it, and field data such as the time of day and the location, how many birds were there, and what were they doing, their behavior while they were vocalizing or singing. So you do not have to be a scientist to submit. Anyone can submit a recording to the Macaulay Library, and they grade them by their quality. But I got a couple of mine on there. The chimney swift, for any birders out there. I got a chimney swift. I have a yellow-billed cuckoo, and several others. Those are the two I remember. But yeah, I was excited when they emailed me and they let me know that they were including some of my recordings and some of their species pages on their website, the All About Birds page.
I think that is just fascinating, and I am just thrilled to meet a Sasquatch investigator who has such a well-rounded experience out in the wilderness, where you're having an impact over and beyond just looking for Sasquatch. And I'm sorry, I want to toot your horn for it. That's all there is to it. I think you're doing an outstanding job. I mean, I really do. And if nothing else, this to me is verification that you're doing something right. And that's what I'm wanting to say, I guess, is more than anything is, 99.9% of Sasquatch investigators or enthusiasts or whatever, we're just going out there and they're only looking just myopically only for Sasquatch. And too many times they see Sasquatch behind every tree, it seems like. You're out there, you're holistically looking at the environment, and you are finding things that the greater scientific community is finding useful. You're expanding our base knowledge of those areas and just being a very good contributor. And I think, if nothing else, that makes you an excellent ambassador of the Sasquatch community in the greater wildlife community in whole. And I really think you need...
That's what I strive to be as an amateur naturalist. It's important to, if I'm going to pursue this line of inquiry with the existence of the Sasquatch, to do it in a way befitting that I collect and submit other kinds of data for other species. And also it's practice. If I'm out there field recording, if I'm out there tracking a wolf or a mountain lion, it's not a Sasquatch, but I know what I'm looking at. Casting these tracks. I've cast many wolf and bear and mountain lion, bobcat, deer. I have a rather large plaster cast collection of wildlife tracks that I've encountered while I've been out. And the idea is you don't learn something and then save it, not practice that skill or execute on that skill until you find Sasquatch evidence, because many of these skills are perishable. They're things that you need to practice, like muscle memory, mentally. So that's why these expeditions that I take, and I call them expeditions because they are so long. I'm supporting myself. I organize it and I pay for it. Not only am I there to hopefully collect evidence of the existence of Sasquatch, but also to practice the skills that I've learned. And I do that every day when I'm out there. And I find it enjoyable. It's not something I feel I have to do. It's something I want to do. I enjoy recording birds. I enjoy recording coyotes. I enjoy casting some really neat black bear tracks. I enjoy doing those sorts of things. Sampling DNA from scat or collecting hair. That I know it's not Sasquatch, but I enjoy doing that. And if I can send that to a laboratory that confirms my identification via the DNA that I sent them, that lets me know that I can collect DNA in the field. I can store it and I can get it to them without it being contaminated.
Mm-hmm.
And the lab can readily identify it. So if I can do it for a bear, if I can cast a wolf track, if I can record a coyote, if I can do these things, then if the occasion arises, I can do the same thing for a Sasquatch find.
So, JC, when you do the DNA collection, in the process of that, is it very expensive? I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to learn about the different levels and so on and so forth of the DNA process.
In terms of having it tested?
Yes. Once you've collected it correctly, what goes on from there?
Well, the cost has come for instance, wildlife. If you're sending it to a lab that deals with game animals, for instance, the cost of that sort of analysis has come down a lot. As years wear on, costs come down for DNA analysis. But that may not be expensive. If I sent something that I know is DNA I sampled from a black bear, and I send it to the Georgia Department of Natural Resources,
Mm-hmm.
to their DNA lab, and I ask them to identify this for me, and it may cost. One time I did it, it was just under $300. I think this was a few years ago, and it was black bear. But the issue is, if you were sending DNA, a sample that you thought was from a Sasquatch,
Mm-hmm.
and just for the sake of argument, let's say this was Sasquatch DNA that you collected. I think the issue is not so much price as getting it to the right kind of lab, because that's when you're going to start running into issues where they are not going to know what it is.
Mm.
There's nothing that they can compare it to. So they may just assume that it's a contaminated sample. If they do find human DNA in it or black bear DNA in it, they may assume that it's a contaminated human or black bear sample.
That makes sense.
You're not going to receive an answer that says, "Congratulations, you found a Sasquatch." They're not going to say that to you. So it depends on the kind of lab you're sending it to. And then that will alter the price. That would be a bit more expensive, but it's not as cost prohibitive as it used to be.
Right.
And I'm talking about sampling scat, for instance, or if you sampled a tissue, if you collected a tissue sample from an animal. There's eDNA, which is an emerging field, which I understand is much more expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's environmental DNA. So DNA that's shed in the environment. For instance, there are scientific researchers that can sample water from a river.
Mm-hmm.
And in that water, they can detect DNA from certain fish species. So they can say, oh yeah, there are salmon or there are perch or there are whatever in soil. If a Sasquatch were to walk obviously barefoot, with the sole of its foot making contact with the substrate, it may leave skin cells in those tracks. If you collected it, someone was able to examine it, possibly they could extract some sort of DNA from that. But that's environmental DNA, and not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about sampling directly, like I said, scat or blood or tissue or hair.
Let's change gears a little bit. Now, when you go camping, it sounds like you do a lot of solo camping. Can you give us a little bit of rundown on that, and maybe what precautions do you use while you're doing your solo camping and your research in the field?
Certainly. First of all, it's not advisable to go out in remote locations like that, especially for extended periods of time alone. But I'm hard pressed to find anyone that can accompany me out there. So I end up by myself. So because of that, I do take certain precautions, like a GPS beacon. It's called an ACR. I know there are different. I think there's a Spot is another brand. There are several. You carry them on your person. And if you, for whatever reason, become injured or incapacitated, not able to make it out on your own, you can activate this device and you can signal for help that way. So I do carry that, and I haven't had occasion to use it yet. I try to be careful. I try not to engage in activities that are unnecessarily risky, because I am by myself, and it's quite easy to fall. It's quite easy to break a limb. So if I don't, and again, I haven't felt like I've ever had to do anything like that, like scale a cliff or, anything dangerous in the course of my investigations. I haven't felt like I've ever had to do that, but I steer away from things like that. First aid kits. I take first aid training every 2 years, wilderness first aid. There are a couple of schools that do that provide that sort of training. Those are, I do carry a sidearm, and not for animals, but for people. I think anyone that spends enough time out in the wilderness can probably think of a few occasions where they have encountered strange people at strange hours. I've been out there and seen people parked on the side of the trail in the vehicle with the cab light on at 2:30 in the morning. Now, I don't know what they're doing out. I'm out there investigating Sasquatch. I know what I'm doing, but I don't know what they are doing out there. People come into camp at night. I've had that happen a couple of times. So I carry a sidearm for personal protection, and I do have bear spray, which I don't use. I carried it when I was in Yellowstone. They have grizzly bears, brown bears there, but in the Blues, I've never carried it. The only bear species in the Blue Mountains is the black bear, and they're more likely to flee from you than to challenge you. And like I said, I try to be aware of my surroundings. So those are the precautions I take when I'm out by myself.
I find that interesting because I know in the Cascades, especially back at right around 2000, there were reports of brown bear, of grizzly, that were coming back down almost as far as, I think I remember hearing one report that it made it as south as Rainier, because they were coming back down from Canada and everything. I'm surprised, actually, that, I guess the Blues are somewhat isolated from the Cascades, but it kind of surprises me that there's no reports or sign or anything of them at all that you've ever come across.
No, and grizzly bears do roam. As a matter of fact, recently there have been cases of people shooting polar bears legally. They thought they were polar bears, but they were polar bear grizzly hybrids. Apparently grizzly bears are moving north into territory that historically is polar bear territory, and they're breeding. So they do roam. Grizzly bears, mountain lions, coyotes, wolves, all of these animals roam. They're not restricted to the particular park that we say they should be in. For instance, Yellowstone. They go where they want to go. And in some cases, they will travel hundreds or thousands of miles. But to my knowledge, grizzly bears have not been reported in the blues. I have encountered people that have said there are brown bears in the Blue Mountains. And I think what's most likely going on there is they're misidentifying black bears. In the Blue Mountains,
You mean like a cinnamon bear or something like that? A cinnamon black bear?
Exactly.
There
Exactly.
I was about to say, there are multiple varieties of the bears out there. Could you go into a little bit of that?
Yes. There are 5 pelage colors for the black bear up there. And when I say black bear, I'm referring to Ursus americanus, the black bear. There are 5 pelage colors. There's the black bear, black with a black snout. There's black with a cinnamon snout. Then there's the cinnamon bear, which I have seen cinnamon bears up there. There are blonde black bears. They're not white, like the Kermode bears up in British Columbia, which again are black bears. They're not albino bears. They're white black bears. But these are blonde bears in the Blue Mountains, and like bleach blonde. It's unusual to see. And then the 5th is what they call a Blue Mountain Panda, which I've been hearing about them for years, and I had never seen one until 2018. I captured 2 on my camera traps, and I saw one on a road while I was driving. And these bears are the result of a black bear and a blonde black bear mating, and the resulting offspring normally have black limbs. Their legs are black, and then they'll have blonde flanks, blonde back, and they'll have a black face. So they have picked up the nickname Blue Mountain Panda. And I got to see a couple of those. It was interesting. I was excited to see them.
Again, I go back to, you just have so much more experience than a lot of people do with the amount of time that you're able to spend and devote, that you're able to see these things that even professional wildlife officials and researchers, they don't necessarily see very often. And again, I go back, kudos to you. Kudos.
Absolutely.
Well, and it's really just a matter of effort. Anyone that is interested in learning, and I love learning, especially about natural history. Anyone that puts forth the effort, what I am doing, what I do, is not special or extraordinary. It's just that I have a passion for it. That's why I do it. In terms of your last comment, you said some people who work in those areas don't even see some of these animals very often. The man that was so fascinated with my American marten photograph, as I mentioned, he was a wildlife biologist. He worked in the blues for the state of Oregon for 40 years. And some of the research that he conducted out there was on American martens. And he told me that in 40 years, he's only ever seen 2 American martens. And when I was there, the year I took the picture was the first one I saw. The next year I was there, the fourth day, my fourth day on the ground, I saw another one, but I wasn't able to photograph it. And I sort of felt like that was my Sasquatch story, because I told him I saw another one, but I wasn't able to photograph it. And he sort of looked at me like, oh, yeah, sure you did. Because I got to see two in the 5 or so years that I've been going to the Blues, or 4 years I've been going to the Blues. So yeah, it's the amount of time you invest and how observant you are. I think how willing you are to travel beyond your base camp to get out into the woods, to get away from the main roads and to get away from the hiking trails, to follow the creeks and streams, to break brush, to bushwhack where possibly no one's ever been before. No one's ever set foot in on that particular piece of real estate that you're standing on right now, while being safe about it, carrying maps and GPS and compass, knowing how to map read. That's another skill. That's something I learned while I was in the Army. Having maps of your area, that's important. That's something I should have mentioned before. There's a website, mytopomaps.com, I believe, and you can create your own map of just about anywhere on Earth. You can custom design the map how you like, what map scale you want it to be, what particular area of a certain forest that you want in your map, whether you want it in miles or kilometers, metric, UTM, Universal Transverse Mercator, or the lat long maps. And I do that. I make maps for the areas that I'm in. And I know at any given moment, I know where I am, or where, what direction I'm moving and how to get back. So that's one of the best investments I've made, I think, are the maps that I've made and purchased on that website.
Of all of the different skill sets you have and tools, everything you have at your disposal, what do you think is the most valuable?
I would say objectivity. Maintaining my objectivity in the field is the greatest asset I personally possess. I think it's important to be able to see something or hear something, to have an experience, and be able to step back and critically examine what it is that you have just found or what you have just experienced, to find the most likely answer for what it is, and to take your time doing it. To not jump to conclusions simply because, I would love to be able to report having seen a Sasquatch or having documented a Sasquatch trackway. That's why I'm out there. But I don't want to not have the background, the basic background and knowledge and skills to misidentify something and not critically examine it, jump to the conclusion that it's what I want it to be, which is a Sasquatch, and tell the world about it and look foolish afterwards because they're black bear tracks or they're human tracks, unshod human apparently walked through here. So you certainly have to know what you're looking at, but you have to know how to ask questions and when to ask questions, and maintaining a certain level of objectivity helps you do that. I can go back and reference whatever skill sets I may have, ask questions, and that helps me come to not the conclusion I want to, but the conclusion I need to, which is what it actually is, if I can explain it. There are certainly times when I've heard things and seen things I didn't know, or I don't know now even what it was, but I can't assume that it was a Sasquatch. It could have been a million other things before it was that.
And you see, that very thing is what separates you from a great number of people running around in the woods. You're willing to say, I have no idea what that was. It could be any number of things. And
I'm not afraid to say I don't know, and I have said that more times than I can count.
yeah.
I would rather say I don't know than contrive an answer simply to please you. If that's what I'm doing, I have no credibility. That was something an old E6 told me when I was in the Army, a staff sergeant. We were having a conversation. I was an E5 sergeant at the time, and he was talking to me, and he told me that the only thing you have that cannot be taken from you, but you can give away and lose, is your integrity. No one can take your integrity from you, but you can give it away. You can sell it to the highest bidder. And if I were sensationalizing finds that I made or tried to appear more successful at being a Sasquatch investigator than I am, I've just lost all credibility. I don't have any integrity. I've lost all credibility as far as I would be concerned. So credibility, integrity, those are things that are important to me. So if I do this for the next 40 years and never see, hear, or find anything, that is what I will report. It may not be exciting to a lot of people, but it's the truth.
Okay. JC, let's go into if you did find something, and let's use a trackway. The situation I'm gonna put out to you would be, let's say a road, along a roadside, and it followed the road a little bit and then crossed, it appears, and you may have one or two really clear tracks that are just absolutely pristine. I mean, you'll probably get dermal ridges out of these things. And then the rest of them are going to be, because of the substrate, indistinct. Okay. And I'm not going to put a limit on how long it is, but I'm guessing 10 or 12 steps or something, I don't know. But anyway, let's say you found something like that. What's actually entailed in correctly documenting that? Can you give us kind of an overview of what your workload would be?
Yeah, it would. That's where the work would begin. And why I mentioned in the beginning, doing research before you go out and investigate. You have to know what it is you're doing, and be prepared to do that before you're faced with such a find. Mm-hmm. So materials like Dr. Meldrum's field guide, his first one, his Sasquatch field guide, he goes into detail beyond just casting a track in whatever gypsum medium you're using. I use plaster of Paris because it works fine. And it's cheap. You can get a lot of it from a Home Depot or a Lowe's. And I carry several hundred pounds of it in the back of my truck. beyond casting, there is measuring the gait parameters, taking measurements of the step and the stride, measuring the individual tracks, the angle of gait, how far the track or the foot may have deviated inward or outward from the direction of travel. Photographs. I take photographs to form, and I've done this on my own tracks. I've walked in mud and practiced creating a photogrammetric map, or photogrammetry. You can type that into a Google search and learn everything you want to know about it. But I take overhead pictures, directly overhead with scale items in the picture, included in the pictures, that don't move. Everything stays in place. I'll have a tape, measuring tape, running the length of the trackway, and rulers coming directly from the measuring tape to the heel or the rear foot of each track. And I include all of that in the pictures. Everything is in place and does not move. I stand overhead and I take photographs, making sure that I try to stay the same distance above each track as I take photographs. So I'm taking photographs directly overhead of each track, and I include the measuring tape and the rulers and overlap the photos. And the reason for that, to overlap the photos, is you can use programs such as one that I found online. I'm sure there are others that may be better, but this particular one is called Photo Stitcher, and it will take all those photographs and, using the reference points in each photograph, stitch them together. So that's why you want to overlap the pictures, so the program knows that the bottom half of this second photograph is the top half of the first photograph you took, using the measuring tape and the rulers and the track and so forth as references for the program. It'll stitch them all together and make one continuous scaled picture of the entire trackway. So if it was a 30-meter trackway, you've got every meter of that 30 meters photographed, that entire measuring tape photographed, every track photographed, and it's a scale representation of the trackway. And you can use that to go further, to incorporate it into a Google Earth map and orient that photogrammetric map you made into the landscape and show exactly what direction the tracks were moving from and to, and what terrain they were found in, and what the surrounding area looked like. You can get pretty detailed with it. But yeah, there are dozens, hundreds, depending on the length of the trackway, of measurements. I carry forms that I've made. I do a lot of thinking about this, and when I practice, like making my own tracks, I'll think of things. Oh, you know what? I might want to record this or record that. So I make my forms to include that information. And it's simply a matter of filling it out like you'd fill out any other form, of every measurement I take, the types of photographs I'm taking. If you have a drone would be a great way of getting an aerial shot of the trackway. You can also make a photogrammetric map, generate one with drone photographs or video. You can do the same thing with that. And it's a scale model of the trackway. So it's not just a series of plaster casts. It's everything that animal was doing how it was walking. You might be able to determine how quickly it was walking, or was it running? Did it stop? Those sorts of things, behaviors, because that's important. And that's why I enjoy tracking so much. Tracking you track an animal, those tracks are telling you a story. Sasquatch leaves tracks just like a mountain lion does. A Sasquatch tracks can tell a story just like that mountain lion's. So you're recording all of that. You're documenting that. So through pictures and video, through the forms that I've made, I back all that stuff up on my laptop, and I have a external hard drive that I take with me as well. So I have 2 backups in case something happens. And then the very last step, is to cast those tracks. If there are tracks that I would attempt to cast anything that I thought was a track, I would attempt to cast it. Oftentimes something that may not look like much to you in the particular lighting that you're looking at it in may look completely different when it's cast. I would also attempt to go forward in the direction of travel to find more tracks and go the reverse direction and see if I could find more tracks in the direction from which this animal walked. You might find that just through those woods where it apparently emerged, there's an open area and it's muddy, and there are 5 excellent tracks in there. But if you never looked, you would never know. You were laser focused on the ones that you did see. So I would make an exhaustive search of the area. Again, drones can be useful in that. There are times in the forest where you think it's just trees, a solid wall of trees. But just a few meters inside that wood line, it opens up. And there are springs and there's mud and a great substrate for recording tracks. Also, a track experiment that I did led me to, I sort of had I think you guys called it a duh moment. I got to the Blues and I made a series of tracks of my own that I was aging. I wanted to see how the weather affected the tracks in an attempt to learn how to age tracks. If I found a track, I could say, well, this track was obviously made in the spring when it was muddy. That's when this track was deposited. So if it's in August, I can say that this track is several months old. And the tracks that I made lasted. I cast them on the last day. And dermal ridge detail was even retained in both tracks. It had been eroded a little bit, but it still maintained a lot of detail, simply because in that part of the world, it's very dry. There is not a lot of precipitation. And in the spring, when everything's muddy from the snow melt, when tracks are laid in mud over the course of the spring and summer, that mud hardens, it's baked hard, and they'll last for months. So you could find a track that's 3 months old. A Sasquatch walked through here 3 months ago. But what I discovered was, as I was watching my tracks, plants were growing in the mud in and among my tracks. If I had gone to where my tracks were in that mud 3 months after I made them and didn't know that they were there, I would never have seen them. But they were perfect tracks, perfect human tracks of a right foot, completely identifiable. But there was about, I'd say almost a meter high of grass and wildflowers that were growing where my tracks were. Because when they were made, it was just mud, flat mud. There was nothing there. There were no plants there. 3 months later, there was tall grass. So I started looking in areas that I knew had been muddy because of the snow melt in the spring, and looking in the grass on the ground. And I did find tracks of bear and mountain lion and wolf, perfect tracks that you could not see if you were not looking for them. They weren't these perfect, clear tracks that I think everybody imagines finding. More than likely, you're not going to find tracks like that. but it taught me to look beyond the areas where I assumed tracks would be. So that was a valuable moment for me, in something I learned in the field just by conducting an experiment. But to properly document a trackway, depending on the size of the trackway, the number of tracks, it would take hours. If you were by yourself, especially, it would take me hours to do it. But I'd have fun doing it.
Now to break to a little bit less, well, actually, in your case, this may be just as serious, but to the rest of the world, it's not necessarily as serious. In all of your experiences out there, you're no different than any other human. What was the stupidest thing you've done in the woods?
I have tripped and fell pretty bad a couple of times when I didn't have to. It was because I had a lapse in judgment. I was a bit careless. There was one time the grass was later in the year, and the grass had got tall. And as I mentioned before, on the forest floor, there are snags, dead trees, the bleached white or gray dead trees crisscrossing the forest floor. You can't walk normally in a straight line. You have to climb over dead trees to get anywhere. And I had my boots the soles were pretty slick, and I thought about changing them out, but I didn't. I wore them anyway. And I lost my footing on one. I slipped and I fell beside a snag that had a limb on it. I couldn't see it in the grass, the limb coming off of this snag, but it was like a sharpened stake, and I fell right beside it. And if I had fallen just a little bit more to the left or right, I'm pretty certain it would have impaled me. And then that would have been a moment to probably use my little ACR if I had survived it. But needless to say, I changed my boots out when I got back to camp, and I did not wear them again. So that was unsafe. Those snags are slick. All the bark's been weathered off of them. And if you have a slick sole on your boot, they can get slippery. And that's exactly what happened to me. So besides almost impaling myself, I think that's what stands out most in my mind now that I think about it.
That sounds a little bit scary.
It was, the thing that I thought most when I hit the ground in the grass, and when I was laying on the ground, I saw it. And I was just thinking about how, if it had just been a few more inches, if I had fallen differently, if I had stepped differently, like I said, I'm pretty certain it would have, because I came down with a lot of force. I lost total control. I fell, slipped and fell, and I landed on my back. And I came down hard enough, and that limb was stout, because I checked it afterward. It wasn't brittle. It wouldn't have crumbled under my weight. I think it would have gone through my shoulder, my right shoulder.
Hard fall, hard lesson.
And here I was just wondering if you were going to have walked into a tree or something.
No, I almost got stabbed by a tree, like a vampire. That's what it reminded me of, one of those, stakes that you see in the old horror movies. They drive through the heart of a vampire.
So, in regards to you talking about not being a scientist, but always trying to educate yourself as if you were one, what would you like to look at next in improving your skill set? in what do you feel is the best skill set you possess besides objectivity in the field?
Well, I always seek to improve upon skills that I've already established. So, we talked about field recording and tracking and so forth. But like I said, that's not something that you do once, like map reading, and then never do it again, thinking that you will be able to do it when you need to. So I will continue going to cyber tracker evaluations and certifying higher than I did before. Going to workshops. And you can find, for instance, Cornell Lab conducts workshops and courses on field recording and bioacoustic analysis. Their primary focus is on birds because that's what the Cornell Lab does. But the equipment that you train on and the techniques that you use can be applied to anything. Map reading. I have my maps and I study them often to maintain my ability to read them and to navigate. Things I'd like to look at. I'd like to look at more. I think I may have found some opportunities here at home to accompany wildlife biologists here in the state of Georgia to study black bears. And they do a lot of DNA sampling, investigation of den sites and things like that, to learn more about the equipment that they use in the field, how they preserve their samples, and how they collect them. Techniques that are used to study animals that we already know exist by people who study them. They're the same techniques that we can use in the field to gather data about the Sasquatch if we find evidence of it. Those are the sorts of field skills that I seek to improve or learn.
Do you find that there is a difference when you record your bird sounds versus mammals?
Yes.
In your technique, that is?
I think the biggest difference to me would be that with birds, you can approach within you can get pretty close to them. If I was that close to a mammal, it would have stopped vocalizing and been long gone. So with a mammal, you tend to be farther away from them. And if you are recording it, it doesn't know you're there. Mammals are much more cagey. A coyote, for instance, is not going to let you stand 30 feet from it while it's vocalizing and record it. Mm-hmm. If it sees you, it's gone. So, which is why a lot of mammal vocalizations are recorded at a distance. They're not going to be as clear as a bird recording, because I can clean that up on the front end while I'm in the field. I'm not using software to enhance the recording. I'm using the recorder and the microphone to enhance the recording. I can decrease background noise by focusing more sharply my parabolic dish, by focusing more sharply on the bird, by controlling the levels on my recorder. Mm-hmm. So I'm getting a clear, true representation of that bird's vocalization because I'm sitting there looking at it. I know precisely where it's vocalizing from. If you hear a mammal that's, it could be 100 meters, it could be 50 meters from you in the wood line off of a road, it doesn't know you're there, but you can't see precisely where it is. So if you're using something like a parabolic, you have to search for that sound. until it starts to get louder. You have to search for it, and then you're going to have terrain features or trees which are going to influence how that recording sounds versus how the animal actually sounds. Sound deflection, you may not pick up all of the elements of that animal's vocalization. Maybe you're only getting the high tones, you're not getting the low, or you're only getting the low and not the high. So it may not be a true record. Does that make sense? A true representation of what that animal sounds like. And if you attempted to get closer, that coyote would stop.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be there when you arrived. So that's the greatest difference that I find. It's harder, which is why in the Macaulay Library, if you look, they have hundreds of thousands of animal recordings. And the vast majority of those are birds.
Right.
They do have neurons or amphibians. They have frogs and toads, and they do have mammals, but they are not represented like the birds are. They may have 100, 200 American robin recordings, and they may have 60 coyote, Canis latrans, recordings, which are more or less 60 variations of the same vocalization.
Mm-hmm.
So it's more difficult to record mammals.
And because of that difficulty, it is much more difficult to associate a new sound with an existing animal. And so it's highly likely that sounds that people record, they actually can't tell what animal that actually is, because no one's gotten the magic moment of actually seeing the animal and recording the animal visually as it's making that sound. Am I correct?
That's true, and you can use resources. I'm in touch with several bioacousticians that I've met, and from time to time, I will send them a recording to listen to with the appropriate field data and ask what they think it is. I don't send them a recording and tell them that I've recorded a Sasquatch. I've never said that. I've sent them recordings that I suspected were coyote, but it didn't. I thought at the time it was new to me. It sounded unusual to me, but I suspected it was coyote or canid anyway. And I sent one recording in particular to 3 individuals. 2 of them were coyote researchers here in Georgia, and one was up in Alberta, Canada. And all 3 of them said that it was definitely coyote. One went further to say that it was a breeding pair, and that particular vocalization that they were making is one that they make when they pair up and they establish their territory before they breed. So this particular researcher, scientist, like I said, that works for the state. Actually, no, he worked for a university, University of Georgia. He said that he has heard that in the field here in the Southeast, and went on to say that coyotes have regional almost accents, depending on what part of the country or the continent that they're from, they can sound different. So while always being coyotes. So coyotes recorded in Georgia and Alabama may sound slightly different than ones in California and Oregon. So not only do you have a vocalization which many people might find strange and might think was a Sasquatch, but now you're dealing with regional variation within a species, which would make it harder for people who are going out to record a Sasquatch. And they say, well, that doesn't sound like a coyote because it doesn't sound like this particular recording that's in the Macaulay Library. And it's important to know, well, where did you record that? And they may have recorded it in Florida. Well, that coyote vocalization that the Macaulay Library has may have been recorded in Washington State. They're both coyotes, but they sound different. So there are a lot of things to consider. It's not cut and dry. Even with animals that are well known, well established, that have been studied for decades, it's still not cut and dry.
Like a cougar's howl, or screech, or whatever what is it called when a cougar
Bobcats
screeches?
do it as well.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
They scare the cruddy crackers out of people.
They do, because not everyone hears it.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're out looking for a Sasquatch and you hear something that sounds like a woman screaming, you know, what conclusion are you likely to jump to if that's how you conduct your research? That's why I say objectivity.
Exactly.
Step back. Is it likely that I'm going to hear a Sasquatch scream? And the answer is no. For every Sasquatch, there may be 10 mountain lions. And mountain lions, in a lot of areas, are on the decline. In some areas are not. But you're more likely to run into one of the hundreds or thousands of other animals in a particular location, before you experience a Sasquatch. And that actually, if you guys don't mind me telling an encounter report that I received, it involves a vocalization, an unknown vocalization, and another interesting bit of information this is one that I personally documented that raised my eyebrow.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was in the Blues. I was camping, and I had been out all day, and there was another site near where I was. No one had been there. I hadn't seen anybody for weeks. And I had returned after having been out all day, and there were a couple of trucks, and there was a tent set up over there. And there were these two older gentlemen that were there, and I started talking to them. And they were there to hunt. They had been hunting out there for, I think they said 30 or more years in the Blues. And one of them asked me, he said, "Hey, while we were setting up our camp, I hope you don't mind, but I walked around yours and I noticed that you had a bunch of cameras aimed at your truck. And I was just wondering why you did that." I was not going to bring up the subject of Sasquatch with them or what I was doing out there, but he had seen all my cameras. And I told him, I said, "Well, I'll be honest with you." And I explained to him why I was there. And one of them, the older of the two, he said, I had something happen to me once. It was myself and a buddy of mine about 40 years ago. So he just volunteered this information. I'd never met these guys before. When I told them what I was doing out there, they didn't think it was humorous. They didn't poke fun at me. In fact, it reminded him of something that had happened to him. And I said, "Oh, well, I'd like to hear about it, if you don't mind telling me." And he began telling me that about 40 years ago, he was elk hunting with a buddy of his in Oregon. And they were sitting in their tree stands. He said they were about 100, 150, I think he said, feet apart in their tree stands. He might have said yards. I don't remember. I have it written down. But they were in their tree stands. And they were sitting there all morning, said nothing happened. And they got down. They went back down to their camp. They went back up in the evening. They were sitting in their tree stands. They said something was coming through the brush. And it was it was an elk. It was a doe elk. And they thought that maybe she was being chased by a bull, or a cow elk, I should say. It was a cow elk, and they thought that she was being chased by a bull elk. And they waited. After she left, she walked off. Nothing happened. Well, sometime after they saw the cow elk, there was this scream. He said he heard this scream. And he said it sounded like a scream and a roar all in one. And he said it just went through me. And he immediately slunk out of his stand. His buddy did the same thing. And they ran all the way back to their camp, which I think he said was about a quarter mile or so from where their stands were set up. And he said, I was so scared. He said, both of us were so scared we were laughing because we didn't know what to do. We'd never heard anything like that. And he proceeded to tell me that, I've heard mountain lions. He wanted to make that clear. So I've heard mountain lions. It wasn't that. He said it wasn't far from him. He thought it was less than 100 feet from where he was. And he felt like it was directed at him or at them. Well, they were too scared to go back up and get their stands that evening, so they waited till the next day. He said, we waited until well into the afternoon to get them. He said, we were scared. They went back up, they got their stands down, and he decided to investigate the area where he thought that vocalization had come from. And he said there were tracks. He said hundreds of tracks. He said they were different sizes, and he said they think they counted about 4 different sized tracks. He said they looked like a human track, but they were bulkier, is what he said. They were bulkier. So, and I asked him to elaborate, and he said they were wider. They were just proportionally bigger, and there were about 4 sizes. And he said it looked like these things just trampled this area. And he says he doesn't know if that's what made the scream, but that scared them even more. And he said, we've never been back there. And that happened in, I think he said it was 1979. At the time it was that he told me, it was 40 or so years before. But I found that particular story interesting. One, I had never met that man. They did not know why I was there. Neither one of them seemed like people that watched Bigfoot or Sasquatch shows on television. They were real practical guys. They were both serious Christians. Not that lends them any more credibility, but I just mean that I don't feel like they
dishonest in any way.
Tended toward nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, or to just make up a story to tell me. And if he did it, on the fly, and was pretty convincing to me, which is subjective. It's a subjective evaluation. He didn't offer any evidence, but I thought it was interesting that it was the first time that I'm aware of tracks being associated with a vocalization. Mm. If in fact what made the tracks is what made the vocalization. But the tracks were found in the area where it came from. I found that particular encounter report interesting. And I got to know them they were there for about a week before they left. And they invited me over to eat every night. They cooked huge dinners every night.
Yum.
Yeah. So they were great guys, and the one had an interesting story to tell, but it was one that I noted. I made special note of that one.
That makes me think of an experience that I had in the early summer of 2000. This was out just, if I remember right, it was just east of Skookum Meadow. I would have to look at my topographic map I have of that area. I've still got the map. And my best friend had flown into town, and he knew, he knew we were moving out of the state at that point. And so this was essentially our last boys' weekend out that we could have. And so he had flown in, and we went out to the area. And our first night there, probably around 10 o'clock, I would say. It was about an hour or so after full dark. We were just sitting in camp talking, and on this rise area behind us, it was kind of a scrub tree line. This particular area we'd been in was near the edge of what had used to be a clear cut, and it was recovering. And in these trees up on this hillside, something vocalized. And this is the only vocalization that I ever experienced for the several years I was in Washington. This is the only one I ever experienced that unnerved me. And it was and your description of it, of a scream and a roar kind of combined, and it kind of just goes through you. That is exactly how I would describe it. I've never been able to find an exact match in all of the possible Sasquatch recordings. There's a few that come close, but this particular scream, it was, I mean, this animal had to have been 50 or 75 feet from the camp. And it vocalized 5 times over about a minute. And you talk about an instant reaction.
Yes.
Because, we had, I had a 12 gauge with me that was sitting on the little table we had folded out, and my friend had a 45, and we literally went back to back and had grabbed our guns because it was so unexpected.
Form a tight perimeter.
Yeah. That's what it was. We were both just looking around as this thing was going off, and we could localize the direction. We knew where it was coming from, but it was just so unusual for what we heard. Now, we never found anything. We still to this day, I can't tell you what made that scream, but I can tell you it had the biggest lungs in the valley, and nothing else happened that night. Nothing at all. But it was these 5 distinct scream roars, for lack of a better term. And I think I can associate with the guy.
And the point of that encounter report that I received was, we were talking about recording mammals and the difficulty, perhaps in some cases, but certainly in the case of a Sasquatch, of identifying what it was that made the sound. Right. Now, in your case, you cannot identify what made that sound. There
Absolutely
was
no idea,
corroborating evidence or indications of
right.
what this animal may have been. In the man that I talked to, he wasn't comfortable saying it was a Sasquatch.
Right.
But he believed that the tracks that he found were connected to the vocalization that he found. And in that particular case, like I said, that's the only, to my knowledge, encounter report that I've heard of that ties a vocalization to some corroborating piece of evidence to indicate what it was that made the sound. And he found tracks, and he described the tracks as being man-like, but just larger in their proportions. And that's why I found that interesting. I talked to another man that was up there hunting, And I asked him directly about it, if he had ever encountered anything in the blues that he thought was strange. That's how I started it. Have you ever encountered or heard anything unusual or strange in your time hunting these mountains? And usually they know what I'm talking about. One guy said, "What, like a Sasquatch?" And then he proceeded to tell me a couple of things. And they were about vocalizations that he had never heard. And he told me the reason why it bothered him so much was that he is a wildlife biologist, and it's his job to know what it was. He said he's never heard anything like it, and he's never heard anything like it since. And this happened to him in 1982. Him and a friend, and the friend was actually there with him the day that I encountered him, when he told me his story about these two vocalizations that he heard. He said, "I have no idea what it was." And he described it also as being like a scream. But that was all he observed, was the vocalization. Right. He wasn't able to tie it to anything else. Unlike the first story, where the first man I talked to, he said he found tracks. So that interested me. In his particular case, if that happened yesterday, and I was somehow put in touch with that man, and he told me what happened to him the day before, and he could take me out there and show me the tracks, and I could document that trackway. If those are actual examples of the Anthropoidopes, Ameriborealis, ichnotaxon, the Sasquatch tracks, then that lends a lot of credibility to what he said he heard.
Yes, it does.
Perhaps that's exactly what you heard. You heard one of these the same creature that left these tracks vocalized at you, apparently. And I've never heard those two things in combination before.
I don't believe there is actually one.
Yeah, that's a unique one.
I don't know.
Heard one.
Yeah, I thought it was when he was telling it to me. I thought it was too. And that's why it was valuable to me. To me, that made it perhaps, in future, if you ever heard something that sounded like what that man described, or Stephen, what you described, if you were brave and decided to investigate where you thought that sound came from, you might find something to corroborate what up until that point was just a story. Now you have tracks, or perhaps you found some hair snagged in a tree, or anything that can support what you said you heard.
Connecting
or
the
at least
dots.
Identify it as, well, I can say, well, I know a coyote didn't leave those tracks. I know a coyote didn't leave that hair. Coyote didn't leave that scat. A bear, or, human. Perhaps it was indeed a Sasquatch. So it's things like that I try to record and bear in mind. That's the sort of stuff I think is important.
And that goes back to why the training and knowledge gained out of the field is just as important, because you're in a position now with the training and the knowledge that you have where you could actually determine that and have a little bit of weight put behind your determination.
Well, and the weight is the data. Yeah, if you can document something 6 ways from Sunday, collect as much data about that track or that vocalization or that scat sample or hair, whatever it is, pictures, photographs or video. If you can provide as much data as possible with your evidence, it adds weight to it. If you're interested in proving the existence of these creatures, which I am. I want to know personally, something I've always wanted to know, Is it true? And if it is, I would like to be able to support my finds and what I said happened with evidence, with data that can be scrutinized. More than a story. I'd like to have more than just a story coming out of the woods.
Everybody loves a good encounter story, JC.
Yeah, but I think we're all tired of encounter stories that can't get backed up by anything.
We need flesh and blood. We need a body. Don't worry. I'm a little bit morbid. I apologize.
No, not at all. It's not, an attitude that's unknown in the scientific world. It's called a type specimen. And normally, a type specimen needs to be provided in order to prove the existence of a particular species. And for something as fantastic as a Sasquatch, I don't think anything else would do. I am not prepared to. My goal is not to provide that. I'm not. If one is ever presented a type specimen, a body, it won't be me. I'm not prepared to go out and shoot one. Not necessarily because I have any moral objection. I think it's in order to prove the species beyond a shadow of a doubt. That's what is going to be needed to counter any. There would be no argument or theory that a skeptic or whomever could contrive that could defeat a body. That would be the ultimate form of proof. I'm just not prepared to do that. I'm satisfied to prove it to myself and hopefully be able to document, record enough data to show that what I said happened actually occurred.
Well, thank you for that point of view, JC. I apologize. I didn't want to put you in an uncomfortable position. Didn't intend for that at all. I was just kind of being a little bit amusing.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not. I'm really not. I know people are so charged. It's the issue of, kill and no kill. Well, Dr. Grover Kranz's attitude was, what if it's the last one? He said, so what if there's only one left? If it dies alone, no one will ever know. And if it's the last one, it's not like you are, destroying the species' chance of survival. There's only one. The species is not going to continue anyway. And then at least we would know, was his attitude. And, the first man that kills one will be a hero, and the second man will get 10 years and find $10,000 or $20,000, or whatever. But certainly to prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt, type specimen is necessary.
Absolutely.
Just because it's so fantastic. I think there's an example of a species of bat that was a new species that was established as a new species based solely on a DNA sample. So they didn't have to kill the bat. But that's a bat. That's not a fantastic proposition. A Sasquatch is unbelievable. So the only evidence that will suffice, I'm sorry to say, would be a type specimen, a dead one. Either one that was killed or one that died of natural causes. Maybe it got struck by a vehicle and died of its injuries, or, there are any number of ways an animal can die.
I hate to say it because it sounds cliche, but it does. It conjures up Carl Sagan's comment that an extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence. And we are very much in that position in the Sasquatch community, whether people want to admit that or not. That,
Yes.
it's just the bar is very much higher for any claims that we make versus claims of any other animal, anything like that.
And there are scientific researchers. There are professionals that are out there that are open to the possibility. Of course, everyone's aware of Dr. Meldrum and the late Dr. Bindernagel, and of course Dr. Krantz. But there are other people that are and no one knows their name. They're not speaking at Sasquatch conventions, but they are open to the possibility. I've spoken to such people myself while out, in the Blues or in the Mount Hood area. And will they go on the record concerning the subject? No, but they've heard enough people talk about it. They may have had their own unusual encounters or found tracks. I talked to one man who found tracks in a plum orchard. He and a ranger were called. He was a biologist. Were called out to a site. Something had been eating this man's plums, and he was upset about it. And he thought it was a bear. He said when they got out there, they looked. The tracks they found were not bear tracks. And he said that whatever it was had left several large scat deposits. He said it was diarrhea. And he suspected that whatever it was eating the plums that had already fallen to the ground and were fermenting. And he said, I know what bear tracks look like. It was his job to know. And he said, these certainly were not. He said they were about 13, 14 inches long. And he said, I don't. And he ended it the same way I've heard others in his position end it, by saying, I don't know what it was. They don't offer a guess. They don't speculate. They just say what it wasn't and that they don't know what it was. But those people are out there. And I think if you had evidence that was strong enough, reliable data, there would be people out there that would be willing to look at it and render a verdict, and not just throw the baby out with the bathwater because they thought it had something to do with Sasquatch.
Well, there we go again. There's that magic phrase, reliable data. And that goes back, that kind of goes, you've touched on it a whole lot, but let's actually talk about it a little bit. You have been finagled some way into making appearances at conferences, and you've actually talked about various little things like that. Can you just talk a little bit about the conferences and maybe your experience with them and everything? I'd be interested in, as much as I think a lot of people would, what got you on the radar for the conferences? Because you don't usually, I know you well enough to know that you don't go looking for attention. And so, if you don't mind, would you go into that story a little bit?
Sure. Yes, it was through a friend of mine, Adam Davis. I met him, I think in 2016 when I was in Oregon, and we quickly became friends and stayed in touch. And after one of my expeditions out to the Blues had concluded and I was back home, he called me and told me that one of his friends, a guy named Russell Acord, he organizes the International Bigfoot Conference. And Adam had suggested, Russell had asked Adam if he knew of anyone that he could invite as a speaker for the next year's conference. And of all the names that I'm sure Adam Davis knows, he suggested mine. And he told me that, and he asked me would I be willing to present at the next year's International Bigfoot Conference in Kennewick, Washington. And I believe that was the 2018 conference. And I was flattered that Adam would think of me and suggest me. And I went after I was out that year. I had been out, and I got out of the field. I took my first shower in 60-something days, and then I headed up to Kennewick, which was only, I think, 50 miles from where I was, from Walla Walla, and presented myself to Russell, and I was shown my room and everything. I got my stuff unpacked, and I had an absolutely wonderful experience there. Russell, Lori, she's one of the organizers of the conference. Russell's wife, even his little daughter. Everybody was so welcoming and kind. All of the people that went to the conference, it was 3 days. I had so many conversations over those 3 days with so many great people that were interested in the subjects, in the subject of Sasquatch in varying degrees. Some people had encounters, some people hadn't. Some people were just curious to see what happens at a Sasquatch convention. But I had a great time. I presented on what I had been doing in the field and what I had found in the field just before I got there, and some of the techniques I use, some of the things that we've been discussing here. But I elaborated a little bit more during my presentation. But yeah, that was my first conference in 2018, the IBC. I had a great time, and I'm thankful to Adam for that. That was nice of him. Other than that, I went to Footstock, where I met you and Jennifer not too long ago. And that was really because of Shelley. Shelley had talked to the organizers of the Southeast Texas Bigfoot Conference, and they invited me. And they also have invited me to speak at their next conference in 2020. I believe that's in May in Huntsville, Texas.
Yes.
And also in 2020, on Labor Day weekend, I've been invited back to the IBC. So I'll be there in Kennewick, Washington, when I'm done in the field. I'm going to go out for another few months this year, or next year, 2020, the spring, summer, and punctuate that expedition with the IBC, like I did in 2018, and present on what I did in the field and what I may have found.
Mm.
So I've had fun at them, and I look forward to the Texas conference and talking to the conference goers. And yeah, I had a good time at the IBC, so I expect it'll be more of the same.
All right, JC, let's change gears again. I want to know what monster do you have under your bed? What gives JC the heebie-jeebies?
Well, I know that what makes me extremely uncomfortable is being in the dark and not being able to observe or see what's going on around me. I don't think that probably is pretty common, but I find that particularly unnerving. I do not care for that. And certainly in my base camps, I don't have, electricity. And during the night of a new moon, when it's especially dark and you're in the forest under the canopy, it's pitch black. You can't see anything. But up in the blues, you can hear everything. You can't, there are no frogs, tree frogs or toads or katydids or crickets, or you can hear everything, every twig that breaks or something that may fall from a tree, and a pine cone that may fall from a tree, rodents scampering about on the ground. And I find when I first get up there, the first few nights, I'm listening intently to try and understand what's going on around me. I can't see because I have a camper shell on the back of my truck, and I built a bed back there, and that's where I sleep at night. I have a big tent, but I use that as a storage shed pretty much while I'm out there, and to stow stuff when I leave, just to secure it as best I can. And so I'm laying there listening to everything. I can't see anything, but I'm listening. And then eventually I'll drift off to sleep. But as time wears on, you get used to it. You get used to sleeping out there. You're not in your bedroom, and then I just don't care. When I'm tired, I go to bed, and I wake up when the sun comes up. Mm-hmm. But there's that part of me that is thinking about, while I'm laying there, I'm thinking about some of those encounter reports I've heard. I have a swing arm on my rear bumper, which has a spare tire on it and a box that I have recovery gear in. And if I'm going to sleep in the back of the truck, I have to have that arm. It has to be open. It can't be locked to the bumper, the rear bumper. It has to be open for me to get in and out of the back of the truck. And one night I was up there. I was in the back, so it was open. And one night, the whole truck, it shook violently enough for me to wake up. And I woke up knowing that the truck had been shaken. And I shot up, and I remember thinking, what was that? And I listened. I was still. I didn't hear anything. Nothing else happened. And eventually I did fall back asleep, but I was curious, what happened? What could that have been? Did something jump on the truck? Or it felt like that's what would have had to happen to make it shake the way it did. And when the sun came up the next day, I tried to get out of the back of the truck, and I couldn't, because that arm had slammed shut that night. And it's heavy. It's heavy. Plus it has a spare tire on it in that box of gear. It had slammed shut, and it shook the truck when it did. And I laughed because I thought, oh, well, that's all it was. The wind must have caught it, and it blew shut. I was parked in such a way that gravity could could close the arm if the wind had blown it just enough. And that's exactly what it was. But that kind of an experience is the sort of thing that I'm expecting. I go out there and I'm asleep, it's dark, or I'm going to bed, it's dark, I can't see anything. And I'm waiting for something to slap the side of the truck sometimes, and that time it did, but it was just the gate, the tailgate, that arm.
What a relief.
So it was, because again, I couldn't see what it was that if something had done that, I didn't see it, I didn't hear it, but it felt as though something shook the truck.
Our imaginations can be our own worst enemies. Yeah.
They can, and no one's immune from it. Mm-mm. And, even me, with as objective as I try to be, there have been moments where I thought, okay, all right, get a hold of yourself. You got to think about this. And that was certainly one of them. But I was in Sasquatch country, It was dark. So what else could it have been? But yeah, not knowing what's going on around me in the dark, that I don't enjoy that.
I'm going to take it from what you're saying that you probably don't do a lot of work at night as far as away from camp. You pretty much stay in camp at night. Am I correct?
Well, I end up in camp at night because I don't have a FLIR. I have borrowed a FLIR, but no, I do not possess my own. There's not a lot I can do at night. And I've always felt I allow myself to speculate a little bit when it comes to I ask myself, if you were to have an encounter, if you were to have something happen, how do you think it would happen? And I've always felt that if something were to occur, it would occur at night while I was in my camp, not while I was out wandering around at night down some road. When I'm at my camp in the daytime, I have a little radio. I'll play music. I slam doors. I cook my food. I have fires. I'm not trying to conceal my presence there. I'm camping for all intents and purposes. If you were watching me from the outside, I just look like a camper. So I feel like my presence, the presence of that campsite would be well established. I feel as though if the Sasquatch is out there, he's going to find me before I run into him somewhere down a dusty road at midnight. If something was observing my camp in the daylight hours or in the evening hours and decided to come in that night, I want to be prepared, whether I'm sleeping or not. I want to be prepared to record that encounter, which is why I have the cameras and the recording equipment in my base camp. Beyond that, I don't think there's anything I could do. And plus, I have plenty to do in the daytime, so I need to sleep. I need to sleep, and I need to get up early because I have equipment to maintain, and it's separated by miles in some cases. Some days I'll walk that. Some days I'll drive it. I also scan the ground, looking for tracks, sign. So I have plenty to do in the daytime. So I need to sleep at night. So while I'm not awake, hopefully my cameras and my recording equipment is vigilant and prepared to record whatever may happen to me when I feel like something would be most likely to happen to me. When I was in the back of my truck snoring, I was dead to the world, asleep, not sitting up all night with a FLIR in a chair necessarily. I mean, it may happen. I don't know, but I need to be sleeping during that time. So that's because I'm by myself. If I had other people with me, then perhaps we could do it in shifts. I'll stay up all night the first night. You stay up all night the second night, and Jennifer stays up all night the third night. So we did always have someone awake and observing in camp, and there was always someone who was well rested enough to go out in the daytime to do the work that needs to be done during the day. But as it stands, I'm by myself. So that's how I have organized my schedule and my work.
I feel like we ought to, just as a public service, we should start a GoFundMe page for your FLIR.
Oh, no.
Oh.
No, actually, I can think of much better pieces of equipment I'd rather have.
Really?
Yeah, that I would rather have than
like what?
Than a FLIR.
Let's expand on this a little bit, because most of the time, myself included, because I just recently bought my FLIR. But granted, that was after 4 years, and I've bought a million other things. I am curious, though, what you think would be much more preferable than something like a FLIR.
Well, for my purposes, I'm not criticizing the use of one whatsoever. Just before I would buy a FLIR, I can think of other things that I would acquire. I'm trying to put a project together that would include all of this equipment that I'm thinking of. I'm putting some stuff together now and talking to some people. At the moment, I don't want to say anything about it in terms of detail. But there's certainly certain pieces of camera equipment that I would rather have over a FLIR. A FLIR would be a great, a FLIR or some type of thermal imaging device. There are other companies that make them. FLIR is not the only one. Is a great supplementary piece of equipment. And don't get me wrong, I would love to have one, but there are, like I said, other pieces of camera equipment that I would rather have. If I could only have one, I'd rather have some of the camera equipment I'm thinking of before I would get a FLIR. But the use of FLIR has been, or the FLIRs has been popularized on television, and I think it's one reason why so many people use them or purchase them to use.
Oh yeah, the FLIR, I see your point about it being popularized, but when I bought mine here recently, it was the result of just sheer frustration, because for a long time I had been night vision only, and in our environments that we have down here in Texas, in the forest areas, they're very brushy most of the time. There's a lot of undergrowth and everything during at least the spring and summer months.
You can't see anything through the ground cover at all.
No. And it practically kills night vision. And I kind of suffer from the same thing you do with the dark. I don't like not knowing what's around me. And I don't want to resort to a, 600 lumen white light or anything. In fact, I don't use white light hardly at all. If I can avoid it, I try to use red only. It's just a personal preference because it doesn't mess with my night vision as much. And so, yeah, I bought the FLIR as much as anything else because a lot of times when a night vision device won't work, a FLIR generally will have much better results.
Oh, they both mess up my vision, so I don't like to use either one, really.
You see?
Yeah, they do. They do.
Yeah, and that is a danger. You rely on them too much, and you have no night vision whatsoever. That goes back to my pet peeve of I hate being out with people who have open screened FLIRs or open screen night vision, and like say they're using their phone. And
yes,
God bless them.
Yeah.
Some of them are really good friends of mine, but I still want to turn around and shoot them when they do that. I mean, I'm just wanting to sit there and yell, light discipline.
Well, that's the other reason why at night, I don't have any reason to believe that they're not just as active during the day as they are the night.
Right. Right.
Since the Patterson-Gimlin film, which was filmed in the daytime, the only other piece of footage that I've seen that I just, again, I'm being subjective, but if there was another piece of footage that I felt was footage of a Sasquatch, would be the Freeman footage, the 1992 Freeman footage. And that was also filmed in the daytime. There are a lot of reports that in the anecdotal record that take place in the daytime. And if there's something ahead of me in the road, 50 meters, 100 meters ahead of me, I wouldn't see it at night. there may be all sorts of things happening around you that you just would never see. And I on occasion, it's not a rule. I have gone out at night a couple of times. I'll go out with my recording equipment, and I'll walk a little bit when I can see. I'll walk a little bit. Nothing's ever happened, but like I said, I have work to do in the day, so that's why I try to get sleep. But there are, I can take a few days to stay up a little later than normal, but maybe sleep in a little bit the next day when I have down days. And I try to take one down day a week. Usually it's Sunday. That'll be my day off when I'll just sit in camp all day. I'll have my flip-flops and my robe on, and I'll just sit in camp all day. So,
we
Saturday
obviously
night.
need to come visit you on Sunday.
Yeah, that sounds comfortable.
Oh yeah. I've had to delete this may qualify as too much information, but I have had to delete a lot of camera footage of me getting up in the morning out of the back of my truck. And I don't realize that I forget that they're there.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll get out of the back of the truck and I'll get dressed, because there's no one out there. I'm not worried about anyone seeing me. So yeah, I'll have to go through and go, I'll need to delete those.
Hey, don't feel bad.
It's a researcher or an investigator in his natural environment.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that?
Don't feel bad about this.
Well, I guess it would depend on your audience.
Don't
The maturity level of your audience.
Don't feel bad. Oh, we have the worst maturity in our audience. I'm telling you, one of my primary criteria when I'm trying to find a new area, and I can't find it very much down here, but one of the primary criteria I've always thought was perfect for when you're going to go look for evidence of Sasquatch is you have to go out into an area where you could be butt naked for 5 days and not worry about anybody seeing you.
And not be another soul. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. If
Well,
you can't do that, then you're not in the right area.
Yeah. We all like to
You're
pick
certainly
boogers
remote.
every once in a while, so why not pick one booger
Yeah,
over the other?
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry.
certainly the places I go, for the most part, especially in the blues, are like that. You can go weeks without seeing anyone.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're in certain other parts of the forest, you might see people every day.
Absolutely.
You might see vehicles or hikers or people on mountain bikes. But in other parts, you could go as long as you can stay in this particular part of the forest. You more than likely would not see anyone else.
That's what I prefer. I prefer not to see daily traffic myself.
And those are areas that I'll leave my base camp for a few days, and I might hike into an area. There's one part, the wilderness, the Wenaha to Cannon Wilderness. There are no roads going into it, and I'll hike in there. To get deep into it. It can take half a day to get in there, and I have a little tent that I bring with me, and food and whatever I might need, a couple of cameras and some recorders, and I'll stay out there for a few nights, and then walk back to the road where my truck is and drive however many miles it is back to my base camp. So I'm not married to my base camp. I'll go out and do overnighters in areas like that I can't drive into. And it's, if nothing else, if I don't find any evidence of Sasquatch, there are so many other things to see and experience in the landscape, and walking up on a herd of elk that didn't know you were there, or seeing a flash of a mountain lion, out of the corner of your eye, or seeing a bear. Or there's a million things to see. Some of the vistas of that I've come upon, and just look out on the blues look over the trees. It's a great experience, and I always hate leaving. It's been my home for however long I was out there, and I don't want to leave, but I know I have to come back. So I always look forward to it.
Doesn't that always suck when it comes up? You just, it's time to leave, and you're like, no.
Back to reality.
Yeah, I do not want to go. I want to stay.
Well, that's the thing. I feel like I am in reality when I'm out there. That's the way the Earth has been for the vast majority of its history. It's only recently that we've had cities and cars and streets
and jobs,
lamps and taxes and, getting a ticket because you don't have a tag on your car and, all of those sorts of things that we deal with. I feel like I'm leaving reality and re-entering insanity.
I like the way you put that.
That's why I like it so much. It's a break. And the icing on the cake would be to find some evidence. But I think it was Rene Dahinden during the course of his time being a Sasquatch investigator, some 40 plus years, he had never seen a creature. I think he had found tracks. He had investigated encounter reports, but he had never seen a creature in all that time. And that was something that he always had hoped for. And that, I may go 20, 30, 40 years and never see anything. I may never even find anything. But I will never feel like I had wasted those years being in country like that and getting to experience the other wildlife and just everything about the wilderness. I love it. So it's never a waste of time.
No, sir, it is not.
Well, JC, we're kicking up a couple hours here, and so I think we're going to round this out and close it off, bud, but we really want to thank you for spending the time that you did.
Yes, thank you for shedding some light and not keeping us in the dark about who JC Williams is.
Yes, we really appreciate not being in the dark there. We do appreciate that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you guys inviting me on, having a conversation. I've enjoyed it.
Oh, the pleasure was all ours. You really did honor us.
And we'll chat later for sure.
Yes, we will.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, you have a good night and you be safe.
You guys have a good night.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Guests of Cryptid Connection are all members of the Cryptid Connection website. Join the community, a safe, secure, and private place for all your paranormal and cryptid pursuits.
Every cowboy, he always misses when he's aiming at the target in his head. And every broken man finds his idle hands grasping at tomorrow's promised land. And I've been thinking about running, and I'll get out on the town just for myself. And that's when I saw her, and she looked right through me. And when I said I do that day, I really do. about the time that I have wasted sitting here. 'Cause I've been thinking that all this thinking is the thing that keeps me further from myself.
The music and soundtrack for the opening is from Epic Film Score by Alex Kaskin. The closing credits are Every Cowboy by Cellophane Sam.